Well, okay. All right, so this is the data management class, right? That's talking about a lot of things. So my focus is ethics and statistical analysis. So we have a few objectives here related to that. We want to be able to describe reasons why incorrect analyses are harmful to society and science, and explain some of the challenges of ethical challenges in data management and data analysis, and then talk about what it means to have a good data analysis, and then describe some of the natures of accountability in data management and analysis. So you guys are in the MSCI, so you probably know what translational research is. You're trying to discover things that will have an impact on patient health and healthcare or public health, etc., trying to improve health outcomes for one or many people. And the goal is to accelerate clinical impacts of your discoveries, by improving health. And the challenge is that now, with the translational research concept, you have basic science researchers kind of stretching themselves and looking at the clinical aspect of things, and clinician researchers looking at the basic science of things. So we're trying to bridge that gap between two different fields. I mean, two different large sets of fields, because basic science is huge, clinical practice is huge, and now translational research is trying to merge the two. And what that does is it puts people in an uncomfortable situation sometimes. It makes people look at outside their field and try to manage things outside their field, which is challenging ethically as well as scientifically. So a central concept, though, is evidence-based medicine. Can anybody tell me what evidence-based medicine is? Have you heard of that? Who hasn't heard of evidence-based medicine? Everybody's heard of it, right? So what are some guesses as to what that means, or what are some informed opinions about what evidence-based medicine is?
Practicing based on the best literature that's out there.
Right. If you're going to treat somebody or practice, do what's proven to work. It's not just what we think is best. I mean, there's always room for judgment, but we try to do things or intervene in ways that are proven to work, basically. All right, now we're talking about some ethical stuff. So, anybody know what ethics are? But see, the fact that you don't know what ethics are, you don't want to say, doesn't make you unethical, right? Maybe you're ethical, and so you don't tell me what ethics are. So, it has to do with what? Right and wrong. Right? It's the principles of what makes things right and wrong. Ethics. So, regulations and compliance. You guys have to deal with those, right? In your practices or in your research. What's an example? Can anybody give me an example of a data management compliance issue? Everybody know what the HOP is? Handbook of Operations or something? Yeah, Operations and Procedures, yeah. So in there, they discuss some data management rules that you guys have to comply with, right? So anybody remember any of those rules in your compliance handbook? Like data management.
As far as HIPAA?
Yes, exactly. How you handle PHI is an example of that. Like, it probably wouldn't be in compliance to, have your patient's birth dates and social security numbers on a non-encrypted drive. That would be out of compliance, right? So what do you think the relationship is between ethics and regulations and compliance? Right? Is there any relationship? Could you be ethical and not comply? Sure. Would it be ethical not to comply in general? Probably not, right? Right. But there are cases where it might be ethical not to comply, but there's probably, if you're ethical, you're going to comply the vast majority of the time, because ethics, the concepts of what is right and wrong, are often what motivate compliance. Now, what about accountability? What does that mean? And what's the role of accountability in these two things? Anybody have a guess? Does anybody feel accountable today? Accountable for what you do, you know? So what?
Liability.
Yeah, you're liable for your actions.
And whether you are practicing what you know is right or wrong, especially in institutions like well, let me just text the lab before I won't put this information, but I'll put this information in.
Yeah, you could be held accountable for violations of these pretty immediately. But, you know, if you're practicing, you know, you have something called an electronic health record or, you know, a paper health record that makes you potentially accountable for your actions on the patients, right? If somebody wanted to make you accountable for your clinical practice, what would they look for? The medical record, right? Well, if it's not there, that's a problem. You know, oh, this patient is not even in the charts. What happened there, right? So that would be some way of avoiding accountability. You'd say, well, I never even saw that patient, right? But probably that wouldn't work. But in the charts, you're going to be held accountable for your actions. They're making an account of your actions, and you could be held accountable for them if you're in a lawsuit or something like that. Or, you know, that's probably the extreme version. But
Well, in research, you have to have the source documentation in order to justify the patient being eligible for the study.
right, you're right, exactly. So you have to have it, but maybe no one will look at it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. If you knew no one would look at it, that would be one thing. But as it stands, you never know if they will or they won't. So, and the act of looking at a record in order to hold somebody accountable is sometimes called an audit, you know. And audits are part of regulation and compliance. Like, you might be held accountable, but the regulations of the institutions are that, or their rules for compliance are that they have to audit every so often, you know. That. So these three concepts, ethics, right and wrong, sort of like the big picture, the regulations that sort of outline how you should act, and accountability is sort of checking back and making sure that you acted in a way that was acceptable. And maybe these happen, maybe they don't, right? Most of the time, we hope they do. But this is going back to evidence-based medicine a little bit. Here is a list of compounds for cancer drugs, and this is how often they pass phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 registration and approval, right? The different steps in drug development. And assuming that they all pass through phase 1, that's like your safety and tolerability test. You know, they didn't instantly harm too many people. Only 60% of those pass, you know, preliminary measurements of efficacy, right? So then of those in phase 3, only 20% are left. So you're already down to 20%. And of those, maybe, so that they work probably, but maybe it's not worth it. It's not economical for the pharmaceutical company to register it. And lastly, maybe there's not, the FDA doesn't approve it for some other reason, like, oh, there's another drug that does almost the same thing. Why should we approve this drug also? And this one's a little bit more dangerous, so why should we approve it? So what this is saying is that if we don't use evidence-based medicine, our guesses as to what work are going to be right maybe 20% of the time. So that's why we have evidence-based medicine, because we're only right. It's very hard to come up with new therapies, and we're only right 20% of the time. So if we didn't use evidence-based medicine, we'd probably be doing a whole bunch of things that don't work, which is not exactly ethical. So what do we do with our data that we collect and studies? What are their goals for these data? You know, we want to construct predictive models and new theories. We want to see whether or not new treatment works. We want to compare the effectiveness. We want to get rid of the treatments that are ineffective. We want to get rid of the treatments that are found harmful. A good example of that is the Vioxx case. It works, but it turns out that it's harmful. You know, so that's where data analysis can help us. and then monitor for patterns of harm previous to 3 approved therapies, and that's what the VIAX was about. Sorry. So, data analysis and data management are professions. We have IT people, we have statisticians, and all kinds of professions, right? So I asked you in the beginning, should a layman perform an appendectomy, right? What do you think? Probably not, unless they're on an airplane and there's no other non-human primate veterinarians. So probably not, right? Why not? There's lots of reasons. Anybody give me some reasons why not? Not qualified. Exactly. Not qualified. He's not licensed. No, he won't adhere to the standard of care, right? They're technical problems. Like there might be somebody who knows that can do, like a primate vet, maybe if they do an appendectomy on a gorilla, could probably do one on a human all right, assuming he has access to these anesthetics or whatever. But there are technical problems if you don't have any idea what you're doing. And then it's not ethical because there are harms that you could do. Like it's not innocuous to perform an appendectomy. You might harm the person. And there are also specific ethical concerns that you need to adhere to when you perform an appendectomy that don't have to do necessarily with harming the patient immediately. Can anybody give me an example? What are we charged to do before performing a procedure on a person? Before even performing on a procedure on a person, what do we do now? That's right, informed consent, right? So those things would be unethical to do that without their consent. And just in case you guys don't know, probably don't know, but they're actually licensing, they're licensed physicians, dentists, physical therapists, all kinds of licensing. There's even licensing, yes, for statisticians, and now that I wouldn't call it licensing, I would call it accreditation. Like you can have a card-carrying statistician. Look, I'm a statistician, et cetera, et cetera. And it requires these sort of qualifications: advanced knowledge and training, track record of competence, effective communicator, and you have to agree to the ethical standards of the statistical profession. So there's licensing for statisticians, and it's its own profession in and of itself. So you keep that in mind when you practice statistics in your research, that it's actually a profession with its own code of ethics. And whether or not you're a statistician, you should probably abide by the ethical codes of the profession when you're acting in the manner of that profession, right? And it would be nice if you followed those too. And why is it necessary? What are the harms if we don't do a good job and we don't follow those ethical codes? Well, first, we could harm study participants. And you probably had lectures about all the crazy things that people have done to study participants throughout the years, mostly without informed consent, probably. And but even if you don't harm the study participants, you could squander resources by doing your analysis incorrectly, which has another consequence that if you do a bad data analysis, the scientific value of your discoveries will be less, right? You might say the wrong thing, and then it'll put people on the wrong scientific track, et cetera, et cetera. And this actually takes a long time to correct, right? When you say, when you report a results, people tend to think of science as self-correcting. Is anybody sort of familiar with that concept, that if somebody discovers something that's wrong, then people will replicate their work and fix the problem down the line because it just won't pan out. But it takes a long time to do that. If you report a discovery, odds are it'll stand for quite some time before people turn it over. And so if you do a bad job, sure, it might get corrected 10 years down the road, but in the meantime, there's a lot of inefficiency in doing that. So it's better that you correct yourself than rather have somebody else do it, down the road, if it ever happens at all. And next is poor analysis promote public distrust in research. That's bad for funding for everybody. And poor analysis diminished the moral good of helping out people who need it. So I would say that, in statistics, there are always going to be mistakes. Odds are somebody's going to be a mistake. But that doesn't mean it's unethical, right? Because you're dealing with random data. If your p-value is 0.05, if there's a null hypothesis, then 1 in a 20 chance you're wrong, right? If the null hypothesis is true, you'll be wrong 1 out of 20 times. So these kind of errors, the type 1 errors, false positives, or type 2 errors, false negatives, we expect to have those because our alpha is never 0 and our power is never 100%, so we're going to make mistakes. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. So there's a big difference from making a mistake and doing something unethical. Right? Unethical errors would include something like understating the risk of a treatment, errors of neglect, doing a poor job of handling your data and making mistakes, or intentionally misrepresenting your results. Right? That's clearly unethical. So, what does ethical data analysis look like? We need certain things, right? The scientific method, it requires experimentation, observation, experimentation, testing your hypothesis, and then continuing on that route. So if you wanted to say what's a property of good statistical analyses, what would those properties be? Any guesses? Like, what makes a good analysis good and a bad analysis bad? I'll give you guys. Reproducibility? Okay. Bias? Bias, yeah, that's good. Yeah. What's the opposite of bias? Unbiased. Yeah, that's right. Oh, what was that? Objectivity. I don't know, maybe I just put that word in your mouth, but I like it. No. Bias, and you say reproducibility? Right. Ability. Anything else? That's a good list. I like that list. So I thought about it and I said, okay, what do we need to have good data analysis and good stuff? And one of those things, was objectivity. That's my opposite of bias. And the other thing is accuracy and reproducibility, right? If your data is all garbage and you can't reproduce what your result, that's a problem. You want to be unbiased. You want to be open and transparent. That would be kind of nice for other people to know what you do. You want to have expertise. You want to know what you're doing when you do it. If you don't know what you're doing and you're analyzing your data or you're conducting an experiment outside your field, that you could recruit people that could help you with it. Right? And the other things you need for good experimental design, parsimonious model selection. That means using the tools that are simplest that can do a good job. You want to assess the assumptions you make. You want to quantify your evidence, and you want to avoid misinterpretation. So those are sort of my list of what it takes to be to do a good job in your statistical analyses. So element 1 is this expertise, right? We need scientific and statistical expertise. So why do we need expertise? Did I just make it up? So here's a quote that says, the experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those who conduct or engage in the experiment. So did I say that? No. So some ethical code said it, sort of. Some ethical code. Does anybody know what that comes from? So that's saying we need expertise, right? I didn't just make it up. Oh, shoot. It's in the Nuremberg codes. Anybody remember the Nuremberg codes? There's sort of it's a trial that occurred after some kind of crazy experiments in Nazi Germany, and they wanted to distinguish between what was considered legitimate research versus war crimes. So they said one of those things is that people who are experts are involved. So we want to look at that. So expertise is really good. So if you don't know what you're doing, kind of think about it and try to get some help. Or you could just learn about it yourself. That's another possibility. So there's another quote about the need for expertise in ethics. I will not use the knife, not even on sufferers from the stone, but will withdraw in favor of such people as are engaged in this work. So does anybody know what ethical code this is from? Hippocratic Oath. So that's like the code. Are there any MDs in here? Yeah, so MDs, right? You know, you probably, did you guys take the Hippocratic Oath when you graduated? It's like, I don't think they mention this anymore. It's a little antiquated because at the time of Hippocrates, you know, the doctors were different from the surgeons, you know, so that they said, listen, this is our expertise, it's medicine, and we'll let the surgeons do the surgeon thing, you know. But in general, it's a statement that's saying if you don't know what you're doing, let other people handle it, or, you know, stop and reflect a little bit. So research is not a single-person job now. How many single-author papers are there published in Nature lately? Probably not a lot, right? Especially if they have any experiments done. Nobody's doing this in their kitchen, right? So you need help. Multiple people have multiple expertise, and they all contribute to the project, right? And they're neat. They need to be authentic in what they do. And authentic, you know, has many meanings, but in this case, I mean that when you publish a result, you know, ideally you want to understand and believe in what you're doing, right? And if you don't, go back and discuss it with your other team members, your research team members, and then see if you can't understand it. You know? And don't feel bad if you don't, because it happens to everybody. Sometimes, I think the opposite is probably true. We all think we understand when we don't. You know, so, but if you don't understand, then that's probably a red flag. So we have to apply also proportionate scrutiny. That means if you understand the context of things, unusual results are meaningful to you, and you can scrutinize them. Whereas if you give me your data, I won't understand what's going on. You know, I'll be like, well, this looks normal to me. Here you go. You can go ahead and publish it, but if you're an expert in the field, you'll say, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. We should scrutinize the results and figure out what went wrong. So element 2 is objectivity. We don't want to skew our results in favor of the null, the alternative hypothesis. You know, but that's not to say we're ever completely objective. Like theoretical objectivity is impossible. You know, there's a lot of popular discussion about what it takes to be an objective media. You know, what's an objective reporter, you know, or a radio host or something like that. It's who's objective, you know, how do you prove you're objective? It's difficult, right? But one of the key ways in data analysis that we, you know, maintain our objectivity is making a plan and sticking to it, right? Because we aren't skewed by what we see, you know, we have our plan, we have our primary hypothesis, and we have our means to test it, and we're going to stick with it. And, of course, we want to avoid confirmation bias. Anybody know what confirmation bias is? It's kind of like if we see a result that confirms what we believe to be true, we're less likely to scrutinize it. So if a new therapy came along and we said, I don't think it should have any side effects, and we see that it doesn't have any side effects, we won't scrutinize it. Whereas if all of a sudden it has a lot of side effects, we'll be like, oh, well, what went wrong there? We'll look back and say, oh, well, maybe this one doesn't matter, you know, because I didn't think it would matter. That maybe is what happened with the Vioxx case. Maybe they thought, oh, Vioxx should have less side effects than naproxen, so if it did, it's just a coincidence or something like that. Yeah, and of course, develop your plan prior to seeing your data. And element 3 is openness and transparency. We want to present all our data that we can of course, we have to respect the privacy of our patient. We can't say, oh, look, here's our patient's social security number, birth dates, protected health information, etc. And we want to avoid data dredging. And that just means going over and over your data, reporting all the results that you can without putting them into context. And, of course, there's a Vioxx example. I discussed it a little bit before. Right, it suppressed the reporting of cardiovascular events. You know, I keep on forgetting it. I think what they did was they didn't report any events that occurred either at the end of the study or the beginning of the study. Whatever it was, they took them out. And so that when they published the results in the New England Journal of Medicine, the association with cardiovascular disease was not significant. But when you include all the cardiovascular events, then it turned out to be significant. But they didn't publish that. They published the censored version. So in the end, Vioxx was associated with greater than 10,000 excess MIs. So what this tells you is that, you know, if you make a mistake scientifically, it can have a big impact outside of, you know, the patients that you were studying within your study. And again, another example of it takes a long time to fix a problem. If you say something wrong, it will be years down the line before it gets corrected. So it's better to get it right in the first place. So element 4 is assessing the assumptions that we make. You know, all statistical methods. Are you guys all enrolled in the biostatistics course? No? Anybody enrolled? One? The biostatistics course? With John Cornell or... So who liked that class? What? Yeah. So everybody did. Wow, congratulations. No, yeah, that's right, we are. Hi, John. No, I'm just curious, you know. Okay, so in that class, you talked about assumptions, right? The assumption of the t-test. What are the assumptions of the t-test, right? For small sample sizes, you kind of assume that the two groups are roughly normally distributed, right? Roughly, yes. Sometimes more rough than others. But we want to be able to verify or at least assess how good our assumptions are. You know, and there's statistical assumptions and there are other assumptions. You know, like you assume sometimes that your patients are taking the medication, right? You assume compliance. But you can assess it. Let's say you could randomly sample and count their pills if you wanted to, you know. That's not crazy, but so we need to assess our assumption, and this is just a quote about that. Scientist has learned to believe in justification not by faith, but by verification. You know, and these are our assumptions we make. More normality, equal variance, and we want to check them. But, you know, one of the interesting facts about statistics is that it's harder to test the assumption than it is to run the test. So that's a case where you might need some more expertise. If you can't test the assumption or you don't know what assumptions you're making, then you might consult with somebody to figure out, you know, is this data a good fit for the model I'm applying, kind of thing. Yes. But, you know, data, you don't have to trust it. It doesn't get its feelings hurt. But no, yeah, that's right. Trust but verify. And element 5, I think you discussed it before, accuracy of the primary data and computation. This, I think, is, it's, this picture here, as accuracy, is single atoms with the chemical symbol for silicon, I think, SI, and it's like printed. And that's just an indication that, you know, with technology, you can be much more accurate than you can by hand. And of course, if you fabricate your data, it's not accurate. Well, I don't know, maybe you accurately fabricated it, but that's not accurate. Of course, but even if you don't fabricate your data, if you handle it poorly, you mess it up somehow, that's also potentially unethical. And some things people do to data, and I guess to talk about in this class, like how to avoid making some of these mistakes, like, oh, my primary data is in Excel. Can anybody tell me why if you had Excel as your data collection instrument, why there might be a problem? Yeah. It could change everything. There's no audit trail. Like, you do one click. And if there's no audit trail, there's no accountability. So, yeah, you collect your data. It could be all well and good, but then maybe somebody else gets the data, tries to enter a few things, but then they screw up and things are off by one, and then you can never get it back again. You know, that's a problem. Yeah. And in statistical analysis, using point-and-click software, it's good because you can just do it, but then you can just get your t-test or your p-value pretty quickly. But then at the end of the day, if you just made one small click wrong, you know, it's not your fault, but if you make one click wrong, you know, maybe I try to go the box above and I hit the box below, and you're just way off. So using point-and-click software in your publications is risky. And another little fact is that somebody did a study and they looked at the p-values and compared them to the test statistic. Like, there's always a test statistic that goes along your p-value. Like, you get a chi-squared, 1 degree of freedom, p-value. If it's equal to like 3.84, your p-value should be about 0.05. Well, somebody went through, did a study, and said all the test statistics that are published by the p-values, and they found that either one or the other is wrong. So it's hard to get the right numbers in your publication. It really is. So it's a challenge to accuracy to get the right numbers, because if you think of how many numbers go into your standard publication, it's hundreds of numbers. If you're typing those in by hand, you're really prone to making a mistake. And it's not because you're not accurate, it's just because the challenge for a human to do it is very hard to get hundreds, if not thousands, of numbers correct. So it's best to leave it to machines. You know, the machines can be accurate with numbers. They might not know what they're saying, but they're accurate. So, and that's where we get the concept of reproducibility in statistics. That is, if I did an analysis, I should be able to give an exact description of what I did to somebody else, and they could reproduce what I got. And the concept there is, well, I'll show it to you in a second, but here's an example of when people failed in their accuracy. And I guess you guys, have anybody not heard of the Duke scandal with Anil Poti or Poti? No? Anybody heard of it? No? It's on 60 Minutes. It's P-O-T-T-I, I think. So you go P-O-T-T-I, 60 Minutes, and you'll see. Once you hit 60 minutes, you know that probably something unethical has happened. But again, inefficient. It took like a decade before 60 Minutes gets involved, right? So in Duke, there was a clinical trial of a gene expression predictor. And the investigator, Poti, said, look, this gene expression profile can tell me which treatment a lung cancer patient needs to get to live longer. So they published this results, and everybody was really excited. And they said, oh, wow, if we knew what their gene profiles were, we could give them better treatments, and they get better faster, and this is just a miracle. Maybe we should try it with ovarian cancer and all kinds of other cancer to get their profiles. And, I mean, it went a long way. And so somebody said, well, this is great. We did the same experiment at MD Anderson, but gosh darn it, we couldn't reproduce it. It wasn't reproducible. And so the independent bioinformaticists at MD Anderson called up Duke and said, well, how come you guys can do it, but we can't? We did the same thing, and our results aren't the same. And so the Duke investigator, Poti, sent him the data, some of it, and they were looked at it and looked at it and looked at it, and then they found that midway through the analysis, all the gene names were scrambled. Like the expression for one gene was substituted with the expression of another gene. And it turned out that despite this scrambling, all scrambled, all crazy, the gene from that the Duke investigators had a hypothesis about fit the pattern that they said it would fit. So in other words, even though the genes were randomly scrambled, somehow they miraculously got the right result, which is very unlikely, right? So there was an investigation by Duke and said, oh, it's fine. We investigated it. There's no problem whatsoever. But it turned out that this guy, Pody, lied on his CV. He said he was a Rhodes Scholar, but it turns out like the Rhodes Scholar didn't even know the guy. And this was years after, like a couple of years after. So despite an internal investigation, it took the New York Times and another journal called the Cancer Letter, finding out that, look, his scientific credentials are not there. Like, he didn't have the MD. He wasn't licensed properly. He didn't win the Rhodes Scholar. So, in other words, all the scientific evidence didn't make a difference. But you lie in your CV, all of a sudden there's a problem. So, that's a case where if you skew your accuracy, obviously everything else crumbles up from there. And we have this reproducible concept in statistics saying, if you have the data set, the original data set, you should be able to hand somebody a computer description of your analysis, and they should get your same result. That's all it is. And if you did the class before, John Cornell's statistics class, and you're doing stata, like there'd be something called the do file. I don't know if you've heard of that. The do file, yeah. It would tell you exactly what you did. So if you got your data, you'd be able to show, look, here's my do file. This is exactly what it is. This is how I got my results. And then, you'd be accountable for that. But there's problems with that model. It's like even if you could reduce your published results, there might be some unpublished results that are important that don't still you could ignore. And element 5 is appropriate experimental design and sample size. Garbage in, garbage out. If you have bad experimental design, you might not get anything out of it. So this is just a statement saying, you need good experimental design. The experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society. And where does this come from? Again, it's coming from the Nuremberg codes. So do a good job. We want to be fruitful for the good of society. If not, you're violating some ethical principle from the Nuremberg codes. Right? So, as you probably know already, if you do a bad job of designing your experiment, you can't recover that with fancy statistics a lot of times or fancy data analysis. And too few patients will be non-informative, but too many patients cause excess harm. So there's always that magical sample size calculation that we like to do to make sure our experiment is informative but not a burden to too many people. And of course we need to use data monitoring plans. Yep, a few years ago there was a chemotherapy agent. It was anti-immune antibody, so it would go and bind to a receptor, right? And they tried it in primates, and they said, oh, it's harmless to primates, right? And they said, okay, well, we'll see if it works for this. Like, I think it was some kind of leukemia drug. It was supposed to shut down your leukemia, right? So then they tried it on primates. It was like water, But they gave it to a human, and what happened? 2 hours later, they were like in 105 fever, and they're immune. They got a cytokine storm. Anybody hear of a cytokine storm before? It's like an overwhelming immune response to this drug. And so this was a phase 1 study. But the problem was, okay, you see, first in human trial, you expect it's a risk, right? But the problem in this study is that they gave it to 6 people in a row, and all 6 of them reacted in this way. All 6 of them got a cytokine storm. So the problem that they had, that they didn't have an interim analysis to say, listen, we gave it to one person, he became deathly ill. We gave it to another person, he became deathly ill. We gave it to 6 people. They all become deathly ill. So you think that their design was a little cavalier. They should have said, okay, we'll give it to one person. We'll wait a day and give it to the next person. But somehow their plan didn't get implemented properly, and they gave it to 6 people at once. So element 6 is parsimonious model selection weighed against precision, bias, and validity. So we want to be parsimonious, but we want to satisfy our accuracy, our bias, and we want to be valid. This is a statement about parsimony, is that we want to, the goal of science is to seek the simplest explanation of complex facts. So that's what parsimony is. So we want to be statistically and scientifically valid. Complex models need more assumptions, and simple models are more robust. Right? We don't need as much sample size. And if we use one of these complex models, we might justify. We have to justify it because they could have less bias and more precision. For instance, if we're doing an observational study, you can't do a t-test in an observational study because there are all these different factors going on. So you adjust for, let's say, age, gender, etc., that might account for that. And some higher complexity models are justified when they're confounders. And I take it you guys know what a confounder is. And simple models might ignore confounders and give you completely erroneous results, right? So, but sometimes we're in a situation where we need a complicated models, but our sample size aren't large enough. Sample size isn't big enough, so we're kind of stuck. We can't do anything in that situation. So here's a little graph I wanted to show, like sort of the things that are opposed to one another. Bias and variance are opposed to one another, and parsimony and our fit with data, simplicity and our fit with data are opposed to one another. We can have a really complicated model that exactly fits the data, but it won't be valid. And we could have a very high precision model that'll be highly biased. Or we can have a low precision study that won't have any bias, but we don't have any power. So this is kind of a graph as to where we should be with our model complexity and our bias variance trade-off. So element 8 is interpretable quantification of evidence. That is, when we get a p-value, we want to know, is that a real p-value or is that invalid p-value? You need to have an interpretable quantification of that. And so whenever we do an experiment, there will always be uncertainty. And of course, if we don't have interpretable quantifications, we don't have any value, because how do people weigh the importance of it, weigh the significance of it? And we can express uncertainty in many ways using the confidence intervals, p-values, posterior probability, etc. And multiple hypothesis testing is a challenge to interpreting interpretable quantification of evidence. We could have genomic studies or subgroup analyses that make it harder and harder. Oops. Darn. So who's heard of the ISIS-2 trial? It was a trial that looked at ASA and streptokinase post-MI. And they wanted to see, if you give them these drugs to people who've had an MI, does it help out, right? And it turns out it did, right? So the editors requested that a subgroup analysis be performed. They were like, well, how do you know it doesn't work? It works for all your patients, or whether it worked for some subgroup? And so then the author studied 12 different subgroups. And they said, okay, we looked at those 12 subgroups, and we found that aspirin didn't benefit 2 of the 12 subgroups. So did anybody see that? What were the 2 subgroups that didn't benefit from aspirin? So they were Gemini and Libra. So if you have a Gemini sign or Libra sign, aspirin supposedly doesn't work. Is that real? No, it's not real. It's just because if you divide the sample size by 12, you only have 1/12 the number of people in these 2 groups, and so you just didn't prove that there was significant. So that's just an example of how, if you do a subgroup analysis, you can get some very weird things. Okay, and element 9 is avoiding misinterpreting your data. Just a quote about that. When distant, unfamiliar, and complex things are communicated to great masses of people, the truth suffers considerable and often radical distortion. The complex is made over into the simple, the hypothetical into the dogmatic. So it's easy to get into over-interpreting your data, right? And, of course, why is this bad? Because claims that are not supported are potentially harmful. And the interesting thing about interpretation is that interpretation is not a quantitative exercise, right? Even if you're not the statistician or the data analysis, if you're the first author of the study, you have to interpret your results. And interpretation is done by everybody, not just the computer geeks or the statistician types. It's done by everybody. So everybody has a role in getting their interpretation right. And then you can be right if you coordinate as a team, basically. Or you understand what you're doing, if you have expertise. So here's an example of a study that was published in Nature where maybe the authors didn't really interpret the data correctly. This is a Nature study. I can't remember what year that was in. Oh, I want to say 2000, something like that. Is it here? No notes. No. It was a 2000 paper, I think. So here's the sprint time in the vertical axis of the Olympics. So the winning sprint time of the 1900 Olympics was about 11 seconds for men in blue, and it wasn't done for women in red, but in 1916, I guess, it was 12 seconds. So you look at that curve there, and you see men are down here. Men run a little bit faster, and it's getting for 10 seconds. But down here, if a woman traveled back in time, she could have potentially won the gold medal. That's kind of interesting to me. Maybe Jackie Joyner-Kersee, if she was around in 1916, could have pulled away a gold medal from the men or something like that. But okay, so in the trend, what's going on here? Both genders are running faster and faster, right? But in the Nature article, they said this: a momentous sprint at the 2156 Olympics. What did they think that meant? 2156. What happens here? The men and the women run the same speed. So what do you guys think about that? Do you think that's going to happen? I don't know. But it could be. That'd be interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe. But my key point here is that, let's say, down the road, women and men run the same rate. Let's say that's even possible. It could be. But the line through here is extrapolated beyond the range of the data. So even if it's true that women and men converge to the same rate, it's probably not anywhere near down here. Because if you follow these lines forever and ever, eventually they're going to be running the 100 meters in negative time. So a line is not the best model here. So they're sort of over-extrapolating the linear model to assume that, there's going to be gender equality at 2156, where it might be a lot further out, or it might be sooner, who knows. And another way of misinterpreting data occurs when you have a negative randomized trial. So Boutron et al., they studied negative randomized trial. And a negative randomized trial is one in which it didn't show the difference, but there wasn't any difference between the two treatments. That is, the p-value was non-significant, right? But they found in 40% of the cases, there was a lot of spin regarding the interpretation of negative randomized trials. And you can kind of empathize with why people would do that, because they're disappointed they didn't show a difference. They were maybe hoping for one treatment to be better. So what they did was, the authors, 40% of the time in the abstract, the title, or the conclusion, they said they focused on significant results for subgroups. So we know that's problematic. And then also they claimed the equivalence of therapies. If there's not a significant difference, that doesn't mean that the therapies are equivalent. And the way you can sort of think about that is that if there's not a significant difference, that means that the confidence interval for the difference contains the null value, right? That means there might be a wide confidence interval. But to claim the equivalence of therapy, the confidence interval has to be really narrow around the null value, not really wide around the null value. So equivalence studies need a lot larger sample size. So they didn't prove equivalence. They just proved they just couldn't show that there was a difference. So. And the other thing is they focused on effectiveness of therapies instead of the failed attempt at showing one treatment worked better than the other. They said, oh, well, our new blood pressure medication worked. It lowered the average blood pressure by 5 millimeters of mercury, but that doesn't mean that it didn't beat the other therapy, the conventional therapy, so it's not worth it. So this is just a summary of the key elements of good data analysis. And this is a table. I wonder if I got that. Yeah. This is a table of what it means to have good data in general. Like what good... That looks red. Does this look red to you? Am I blind? This looks like black. Maybe I haven't got it plugged in enough. This projector might be broken. It might be like, instead of RGB, it's just GB. Wait, but you saw red over here, right? Or was that? No, that's not red either, is it? Huh, it's just a GB. The projector's broken. That's interesting. I should find a red rose and see how that looks in gray. But anyways, so this is data, these are data quality metrics. When you collect your data, what qualities do you think it should have? Right? This course, are they teaching you how to build databases and things like that? Right? How to collect your data collection instruments, data access instruments. So these are characteristics that your database should have. And I highlighted in red the ones that also should be true of your data analysis. It should be interpretable, objective, should have the appropriate amount of information. They should be complete. They should be concise. They should be value added. And they should be understandability. I don't know what the difference between interpretability and understandability are, but okay. So, right, I'm going to do a good job. So, what are data analyses? I'm going to quiz John. How'd your meeting go? Good. You're like, that's real. We're being filmed, by the way. Got the pressure. Feeling the heat. I didn't know it, but, you know, I'm trying to go with it. So John, you're a statistician, right?
Yeah.
So what is data analysis? If I ask you to define it, like putting you completely on the spot. So what would you describe? How would you describe data analysis in general? Okay. So it's a lot like leadership. So, okay. So here's my definition. I just totally made this up too, so don't feel bad. I had a lot more time to think about it, and there was no camera involved. So my definition of data analysis, and you can tell me, you know, is this a good one? You ask me. I'll ask you about this. Data analysis is the process in which a set of agents directly or indirectly acts upon the data in order to gain useful information towards some objective. What do you think? Is that a great definition? I pat myself on the back for that every day. All right. But there are two kinds of data analysis, right? We can have the objective could be very focused, like a clinical trial. You're trying to show, hey, look, our treatment lowers blood pressure less than the conventional treatment. That would be confirmatory data analysis, hypothesis testing. The second one is introduced by John Tukey as exploratory data analysis. That's hypothesis generating. We're trying to find out what the key factors are for predicting MI or something like that. So here is what you learn in your data, Stata class, right? Maybe, maybe not, right? You have, in a basic mathematical theory of data analysis, you have 4 steps that are involved in making inferences or estimating things about the population, right? And you make inferences based upon the sample. This is the sample as being some subset of the population, and you apply some model to it, and you infer back in step 4 back to the population based on the sample. We think the population has these characteristics, right? So, but what do we really do in practice? It's different. We're outside the mathematical model, and we're into the real world, where our data don't come from a Venn diagram. They come from people, right? We have a database, and this is sort of time. Data analysis occurs in time. You notice there's not really time in here. There's probably time, but there's not really time. So when you get your data, we validate it, right, John? You don't just accept your data. You just do the t-test. Well, I probably do some days, but most of the time we analyze, we validate the data, make sure everybody is born in the last 100 years, etc. They give us the right birth date. We do some analysis like a regression, and then we communicate that to the other members of the research team, right? And if you're working with a mentor, you'll communicate it with them. And you'll be the statistician. You know, it could be you being the statistician doing some regression on your data. And this process is occurring through time. So data analysis isn't really a theoretical. It is theoretical, but it goes beyond the probabilistic picture that we've drawn here. So this is probability, our theory of probability. And this is our data analysis, our statistical world, where we're actually applying these things in the real world. And if we want to call this a name, we can call it the translational research pipeline, where we sample, we collect the data, we fit the data, we assess the model. Man, I really picked the wrong color to emphasize things. This is red. When we assess the model, we have this internal communication, and what do? We have peer review, right? In each of these steps, we have a possibility of correcting some mistake that we had made. Like we assess our model, right? We could say, oops, there's a problem. We'll go back and get a better model because the model didn't fit, right? Or, you know, in our data I should have drawn a little thing here. Data validation phase. Oh, we collected the data, but this person said they were 5.8 feet tall, or 5.8 inches tall. You know, that happened to me recently. I got a data set that said they were 5.8 inches tall. What happened? They probably meant 5 feet, 8 inches tall, but anyways, you know. So did I analyze the data like they were 5.8 inches? No, I discarded it because I knew that couldn't be the case. So right, the validation phase. So these are all sort of corrective processes. Model assessment, internal communication, corrective. If the statistician says something crazy, then they say, wait a second, no, that can't be. You know, somebody has to have a blood pressure of greater than 5 millimeters of mercury. You know, and then internal communication and peer review. That's another case where you have your possibility of correction. But just like you have a possibility of correction, you also have a possibility of malfeasance going on, right? So, and everybody is in the process is accountable to one another, right? We have the primary investigator who's accountable for the whole thing, right? You guys are going to be the primary investigator. And the data entry personnel, well, they're accountable for getting that right data, right? And data managers, they're accountable for getting the data, putting the data together. Statisticians were accountable for finding the right model fit and interpreting the data and validating the data. And the other team members, these are all the other team members. And the co-authors, they're accountable for interpreting it correctly and doing these other things, designing, etc. Whatever the other co-authors' role. But this process is pretty complicated, right? And the more complicated it gets, and so this is sort of the timeline, in each of these nodes is like a certain actions that people make on the data, right? And the more complicated it gets, the harder it is to get it all right. So good planning makes simple analysis, makes less possibilities of creating an error, right? So ultimately, we want to be accountable for these actions. Back to the Duke case, you had a relatively new investigator, Pody, doing all this crazy stuff with the data. I don't know, John, are you familiar with the Neil Pody scandal? Right. So, but his boss, Nevins, kind of got off on it. Like, nobody really pinned anything on Nevins, his supervisor. But Nevins protected his mentee, Pody, in a really aggressive way. Like, he didn't let people introduce incriminating evidence regarding Pody. So he really protected him, maybe too much. But anyway, but what is Nevins accountable for in the data analysis? What is a supervisor accountable for in the data analysis? And if you don't directly compute on the data, how are you liable for the actions that are done to that data? If you're an author, you're accountable for it, right? You think. So accountability is the ability to answer for one's actions, right? And we like accountability. Do we? Anybody like accountability? I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it. And if you think about the statement down here, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've heard of that, right? And so my sort of corollary to that is lack of accountability corrupts absolutely. I don't know. I just threw that in there. But in order to be held accountable in a data analysis, though, we need to know who did what, when, where, why, and how, right? And that requires openness and transparency, that's what OT, and documentation. And typically this stuff is not really documented. But if we had all this information about documenting what we did, we could document it through emails, through memos, etc. Some people, like Merck with the Vioxx scandal, they sent a memo. Big mistake. Cost them billions. But they documented what they did. Gives weight of personal responsibility. If we knew people were able to audit and review our actions, we might act differently, right? And somebody said that was like the panopticon. Have everybody heard of the panopticon? I thought it was an interesting concept. This guy built a prison in England, I think it was. And, prisoners are not really, you want to hold prisoners accountable to an extent. So he built a prison that was like a cylinder, right? And all the cells were on the outside, but on the inside was a watchtower. So the watchtower could see all the cells. But the interesting thing about it is that the prisoners couldn't see inside the watchtower. So the thought is that the prisoners not being able to know when they're being looked at would behave better, right? So, and that's the concept behind accountability, right? If you write it down what you did, you're less likely to do something crazy or unethical. Sort of the threat of oversight. So, but when we talk about current translational research, documentation of the analysis is really not very well done. Because there's a lot of overhead. We're likely to document the things that we think are crazy. If somebody says, hey, delete half the data set because I don't like people's names, who didn't respond to the drug, right? So delete all their names. That would be bad, and we would document that. But really, we don't know what's good and bad until after everything is done. So if we only document the bad actions of others, we're kind of taking a biased perspective to documentation. So we probably should do a better job at that. But, documenting things is really not easy because there's overhead documentation. And what I am proposing is that we probably need an electronic health record for the data set. So everything that's done to the data needs to be recorded. And, of course, this isn't easy because if we documented everything, right, would we have privacy for study participants, or would we have confidentiality for researchers? Because researchers have valuable intellectual property that goes into this, like plans for new grants, plans for new drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And so what are the requirements of some system that would hold our data management and data analysis a process accountable, right? There has to be a system of oversight. We need to have all this information. And this was studied by Jagenson et al. He's a computer scientist, and they studied this in the context of distributed computing systems. And they said, what would it take to know if we have a hacker inside our system, right? And but this is very similar, and it's a model of communicating messages between agents or people, right? But this process of communicating is very similar to the data analysis teamwork process, right? So what are the key things that our system needs to fulfill in order to be a good, accountable system? It's kind of getting complicated, but don't worry, I'll wrap it up. So we need, and they said there needs to be certain descriptions of how we hold people accountable. The upper bound, they said, was of accountability is everyone guilty will be blamed, right? Does that sound like a good idea? Okay, not crazy, right? Everybody guilty will be blamed, but that means that potentially some not guilty people will be blamed, right? So if you're developing a system that will hold people accountable and you achieve the upper bound, everybody guilty will be caught, you've got to admit that there could be problems with it. You might be too sensitive. You might blame not guilty people. But you could achieve a lower bound also. Everyone blamed will be guilty. So this is like 100% sensitivity, and this is 100% specificity here. Right? And we want to have overlap also. At least one blamed person would be guilty. Right? So there's all kinds of qualifications you can have in terms of catching bad actions. Right? But you want some balance between sensitivity and specificity. Right? And you also want liveness. That is, at least someone will be blamed if there's a bad action. Right? And lastly, you want blamelessness. That is, an honest agent can defend themselves. Like if you did everything right, you should be able to defend yourself. So when we talk about systems for accountability, we want very specific features of that system. That it be sensitive, would be specific, that it be timely in assigning blame, etc. And another important feature of accountable systems, it's kind of like the electronic health record, you need non-repudiation. Non-repudiation means that if you said that you, or if it's in the record with your signature that you performed an appendectomy, that you can't repudiate that. That means that if it's in the record, you're guilty of it, or you did it. Not to say that it's wrong, but you did it. So non-repudiation is a feature that you're not allowed to deny what you did if you have a notarized record. And that's the other aspect, is you need a trusted third party to hold the record for the system to be able to support accountability. So if you own your electronic health record and you could just do whatever you want to it, then you couldn't be held accountable because you could just manipulate it to remove records that you didn't like. So you need a trusted third party. So which is kind of a weird concept in research, because when you do research, who's the trusted third party? Is there a trusted third party? Probably not. But if you use a database, on the other hand, there's a trusted third party in the database if it keeps a record of every change. Then it can say, John Gelfond went in there and he deleted all his patients that didn't respond. So the database is a trusted third party potentially. But if you use Excel, is Excel a trusted third party? No, it's just a program. It does whatever it wants. So you also need to have provenance information. That is, who gave me this data? John gave me this data. I have it in an email. So that's the information about where the data came from and who sent it to you and when did they send it, etc. And the other thing you need in accountability systems is mandatory logging and responsiveness. That is, if you had an electronic health record and nobody put any information in it, they wouldn't do any good. You need to demand that people plug in their information in your electronic health record, etc. So if you wanted an accountable data analysis, you would need to record all your communications between your agents related to a particular data set. And you have different types of agents within that. You have you have experimental units, your research subjects who are entering data, or your data collection people. Your researchers, within that you have supervisors, lab, data analysis, co-authors, etc. Your numerical computers who are going to compute on the database computer. So you have all these kinds of agents that are communicating with each other. And you have several types of communications. You have requests. Planning is a kind of request you make of yourself. You have data generation. You have one-to-one data transfer. Somebody sends you an email. You have numerical data transformations. That's when you use data to get a p-value. You have comments. That's when you send data back and forth through emails. I like this analysis. Oh, no, you forgot to do this. Or these data were invalid. Please stop. And then meetings, when you meet and discuss things and your supervisor tells you to throw away the information. And then 7 is you have approvals and revocations. If somebody doesn't approve of something, then it can't get published. Or, it's probably could get published if there's some negotiations. But if you find that there's a wrong data point and you have to revoke it, everybody should know about that. And publications, that's the final thing that you'll be accountable for. So when you participate in data analysis, you should look at all these aspects, and what do we really talk about in the biostats class? If we wanted to say, what is biostats about? It's about numerical data transformations. Maybe about numerical data transformations and publications, but really it's mostly about number 4. But all these other things really are relevant to how a data analysis gets published and so. So if we wanted an accountable data analysis project, it would have a set of agents, a set of messages of these 8 types, the time sent, who received it, trusted third-party storage system, which could be your email, but that would be a little inefficient. But, oh shoot, the other thing is a set of agent and their conflicts of interest. You need to record the conflicts of interest somehow. The university has a hop that demands you do that now in more and more ways. And so, with this information, you could audit the process. So if you're going to be responsible for the data analysis, you should consider recording all these things. Not really simple. So my analog to this is the Big Bang. You have your data in the beginning, and you have all these things that you could possibly do to it that happen. But in the beginning, you have your data. And they all come from that. But before you have your data, what do you have? Was there nothing? No, you had a plan. So that's why your plan is really the first step. Your plan to collect data, the plan for analyzing data, the protocol, etc. So the protocol is actually the first step. So is this crazy? Who does this? Who collects all this information? Well, if you're a police organization, then you have certain principles that you need to adhere to regarding how data is handled, right? And here are the principles of, this is the Scotland Yard principles for handling data. That authorities will not alter data, clearly. Shouldn't alter the data. Neither should we. We need competence to handle the original. They need competence to handle the original data. We need to justify the handling of the original data. That means in our analog is we shouldn't be data dredging. We need an audit trail. That is, we need in our analog is we need to have reproducible computations. And, well, results must be reproducible, okay. And the person in charge is responsible. That is, if you're the principal investigator, you're responsible for all the above. Okay. And lastly, we like to think all accountability is good, right? I was all about, we want to be accountable. Accountability is good. Blah, blah, blah. So when good accountability goes bad? So does anybody think of an example when accountability can be bad? So Lerner and Tetlock, if you want to Google it, Lerner and Tetlock and accountability wrote a paper in I think it was Psychological Bulletin in 1999. And they looked at the psychological effects of being held accountable, right? Going back to the prison, right, or the panopticon, when the guy, I don't know, were you here for that discussion? Okay. Have you heard of the panopticon? It's like a prison where the warden can see everything, but the prisoners can't see the warden. So everybody feels that they're being watched. So they feel it's a presence of the auditors, right? But sometimes auditors can screw up good analysis. For instance, Lerner and Tetlock said that if you want to have good accountability, you need auditors who have unknown views. Now, why would you need auditors with unknown views? Does that make sense?
When audience views are known prior to forming one's own opinion, conformity becomes a likely coping strategy.
I like that. Man, did you just come up with that? That's really good.
Right on my being head.
Yes. Just super. Did anybody catch that? So basically, you know, we try to maintain objectivity, right? But if we know the auditors themselves have a bias, we might substitute their bias for our own. That is, let's say our supervisor doesn't want this drug to work, or our supervisor really wants this drug to work, and he's going to audit us. So we're going to say, oh my gosh, we better make it look like we tried everything to make sure the drug is work, otherwise it's going to give us a hard time. So we need to have auditors who are sort of blinded. So it's like justice is blind. We need auditors that we don't know what they think of. But we also need auditors that are knowledgeable, right? If we had some non-expert come in and audit us and say, why did you throw this data point away that was 5.8 inches tall? You're biasing your analysis to make your sample taller than average. Then we need, that would be wrong. So we need auditors that know what the heck they're doing. And we need auditors who are interested in accuracy. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. And we need auditors that are interested in the process, doing a good job throughout the research process instead of just saying, are we right or wrong at the very end. That way, if they're interested in the process, they can look at each step. And they'll be less biased that way. Did you just look up the paper? I don't understand. Oh, you did. Good.
From Bing.
Yeah, from Bing. Oh, wow. Bing. Oh. Like Microsoft Bing.
Bing.
Yeah, okay. And then, because I had a hard time looking up that paper, I have to say, but I didn't use Bing. And the auditors also need a legitimate reason for inquiry. You know, so like random audits would be good, right? But let's say we had an auditor who said, wait a second, I just have stock in drug X, and they proved that drug Y was the best, beat drug X. Well, I'm going to audit the heck out of them. You know, so that is not a legitimate reason for inquiry. So when you have accountability structure, you know, that doesn't mean that everything's going to be happy. You need to think about who's auditing you. And if the system is bad, then that's something that we need to fix. I'm sorry, you guys need to fix. I don't care. No, I do care. Okay. So the final point, the owner, the analyst of the data, is responsible for keeping these things open and transparent and keeping these records. And, of course, you need to have these records before you see the data even. You need to record, oh, here's my protocol, which you probably do. And here's my plan for analysis, and not have your data shape your analytical plan if it's a confirmatory analysis. And all communications need to flow through this owner of the data. Email doesn't really work that well because you can have two people emailing each other, and I mean, granted, if it's the only thing you have, it's got to do. But you could have two people emailing each other, and let's say the supervisor has no idea, so that's a problem. And you could use a project management system that can keep all this stuff together. I'm not an expert in project management systems, but that way everybody can look at a centralized, consolidated record of the process that did this. And auditability, yeah. Alrighty, and data size isn't a problem. If you say, oh, we can't record all these things in email, there's this process called data fingerprinting that can keep track of which data that we're referring to. So it's the same thing like a file name, but it's an automatically derived file name, which is a small descriptor of a very large data set. All right, that's all I have. If there are any questions or concerns, we can